Okay, this is a meeting of the Town of Fairfield's Affordable Housing Committee, special meeting of Thursday, September 9th. We're meeting via Zoom. It's now 7:03 p.m. We have with us the chairman, Mr. Brathwahl, Steve Brathwahl. We also have committee members, Carrie Mackover, Nancy Lyons, Cindy Samarco, and Helene Daly so far. We also have our planning consultant, Glenn Chalder, with us, as well as planning director, Jim Wendt, Assistant Planning Director, Emmeline Harrigan, Gretchen Goethner, our recording secretary, and Carla Miklos from Operation Hope. And Mark Barnhart, your master of ceremonies this evening, Director of Community Economic Development. So with that said, Mr. Chairman, would you like to call the meeting to order and do any other welcome and introductions at this time?
Yes, I will. And I see that Heather is joined. Hi, Heather.
Yes, and I apologize for being a few minutes late. I went to go walk the dog in the moment that there was no rain.
You did not miss anything important.
Yeah, we're just starting. We're just starting.
All right, perfect.
And in addition to the members, Jim Wendt and Emmeline from TP&Z are with us. Thank you for joining. Carla Miklos, Operation Hope, Glenn Chalder, our consultant. Normally I would say that only members of the committee could ask questions and stuff, but since there's so few people from the public, I guess basically just Carla, since Jim and Emmeline were invited guests. And so I would say anybody that wants to ask can politely raise your hand as we go through it. You can raise your hand either physically or electronically. And so with that said, I see Herb has joined us soon. Hey, Herb. Let's first get the minutes approved, the minutes from our August 11th meeting. Can I get a motion?
I will move to approve the minutes as presented.
Okay. A second?
I second it.
Nancy. Any comments or questions? Hearing none. All in favor, raise your hand, say aye.
Aye. Aye.
Any opposed, raise your hand, say nay. Any abstentions, let us know. Passes unanimously. We'll go to Glenn Chalder for the main event this evening.
Main event.
Glenn, thank you.
Thank you
very much.
Glenn, you have, I already screen shared. You have permission, I think.
Okay, so hang on a second. I didn't get that set up beforehand, which I should have done. So that'll just take me a second. While I'm doing that, I think that I can speak to what it is that we're working on here. Bear with me just for a second.
And Glenn, I know that you mentioned in the possible strategies some reference to the prior affordable housing plan.
Correct.
And if you could do that more as you go through it, compare and contrast, probably just from memory. But we had 13 possible the last time, you know, and we implemented a number of them. And this time we've got even more possible.
Well, okay, so let me start with that. I think the purpose of the meeting here tonight is start to talk through possible affordable housing strategies for inclusion in the affordable housing plan, the statutory requirement, if you will, for this document, which is, we didn't have a statutory requirement last time. Fairfield did it because they were aware of this issue and had been for some time, and the committee put together a specific plan. This plan is in response to Section 830J of the Connecticut General Statutes. And the plan is required to specify how the municipality intends to increase the number of affordable housing developments in the community. And in addition to that, I think that there are ways that we can also talk about increasing, changing, enhancing the housing variety, housing stock in town. So some of those recommendations are also included here for discussion by the committee, possible recommendation to the Planning and Zoning Commission. I guess I'd like to just state at the beginning that these are possible strategies for discussion. They're not necessarily recommended or advised, but based on the research that we've done so far, the discussions at all of our meetings, the survey results that have come back, discussions I've had with Mark, with Jim, and with Emmeline related to some of these issues, put together a program for discussion purposes. My goal tonight is for us to get as far through this document as we can, to put check marks on things we think we'd like to pursue and X's on things we think that we might not be ready for this, either in the next 5 years or even in a time period after that. To help start to guide the discussion, I've put together, I've color-coded some of the line items. So if I'm just going to jump ahead to the next page, for example. And if a line item is blue, that's because I think it's something that could be recommended in this plan. And then further on down the list, you might see a white line item. And for example, on this page 1.3, that is something that could be undertaken following this 5-year time period, or it could be a much lower priority in this time period. So again, I've tried to use that to help guide our discussion, but I'm here taking extensive notes and I look forward to your comments and feedback. The first thing I started off with on pages 2 and 3 is the whole concept of whether or not, as an Affordable Housing Committee, we think that locational guidelines might be appropriate for consideration as part of our work. I think that one of the conversations we had earlier was that the 1979 plan focused in on centers in Fairfield, whereas the 2016 plan had a discussion about neighborhoods. And housing can, in fact, strengthen communities, reinforce the existing structure in the community in terms of activity centers and nodes. And those nodes could be located near train stations or bus routes. And I recognize the town already has regulations for the town center and the Commerce Drive area. But this might give us the opportunity to identify different areas of town which might have more suitability for higher densities or for alternative configurations of housing, and allow us in Fairfield to be proactive, continue to be proactive as we have in the town center and the Commerce Drive area, rather than reacting to different approaches or strategies. So any thoughts or reaction, if you will, to this general approach? There is a map in your report that identifies some possible factors that might be considered as part of any locational guidelines. Those have to do, as shown on this map, with some of the centers that have been identified in prior plans. The zoning districts actually are in the background. We have transit routes, walking distances to train stations, et cetera, that these might provide some guidance, et cetera, as part of our efforts. But we can refer to the map as we need to, but in terms of text or strategies, any thoughts in terms of recommending locations as part of the plan?
Glenn, can I, before we get to that, can I go back to page 1?
Yep.
So you've stated a preliminary goal with 3 bullet points.
Yeah.
And I'd like to have a 4th bullet point, as was mentioned in the last plan, which is controlling our future.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
I've got a couple of questions. First of all, I'm definitely in favor of 1.1 sense of place, although that probably needs, what sense of place may need a bit of further definition. But my question is along arterial and collector roads. If you look at what's specified as arterial and collector roads, it's certainly more than US 1 and some of the bigger roads that we already know. Do you mean it to go like further north into town, or are you really thinking or along arterial collector roads where there's sewer, public water, sewer. I mean, we have arterial roads that don't have those functions. So that would be one question. And my next question, was there a second question? Oh yeah, there's the map that you just showed where some of the circles are going into the beach area.
Yep.
Particularly south of Old Post Road or even south of Post Road, I'm really, really concerned about kind of identifying that as, where we're going to be looking for increased density, because of what's happening with 6 inches of rain every now and then and more. So that's a concern too. And I think, we need to somehow recognize that in this document.
I think the map was meant to be illustrative to guide our conversation or discussion. Because circles were used in the 1979 plan, I tried to carry those over.
Yeah.
And these are walking radiuses around the train station, which had been used in some public meetings and other things as part of the POCD. So they're not meant to be specific, carry or highlight or point out parts of the beach district in terms of what might happen there. I guess more than anything else, the idea was how did the committee feel about some sort of locational consideration as part of this effort? And I think that map could be left to be incorporated into the POCD, or we could refine it depending on what the committee's preference might be.
I have a question for Carrie. So if we get 5 or 6 inches of rain every now and then, does that mean that we can't build up in the green areas of Greenfield Hill that don't have sewers and stuff?
It doesn't necessarily mean that. It just means we need to think about it. It can be done. It's certainly a lot easier. If you have sewers and waters and we have capacity in both, and we have the capacity in both of those, if we do. But, there's so many issues going on now with climate change and water inundation that we just really need to address it in almost everything we do in terms of future documentation.
And correct me if I'm wrong, Glenn, but that's part of this as well. You've also highlighted areas that are served by sewer as well as those that are primarily on septic versus historic neighborhoods, historic districts in town, although not the actual geographical boundaries of that. But those are all considerations, as is areas that may have some environmental sensitivities, such as Carrie's talking about. So those are all considerations. I think one of the concerns that I've heard, in the past from folks is that, well, then you're directing housing development into only certain areas of town or certain neighborhoods that feel picked on. And I don't necessarily think that that's what you're suggesting here either. You're suggesting a neighborhood-based or an area-based or geographical-based approach, that different approaches, housing approaches, might be appropriate based on those considerations. Correct?
Yeah, I think later on we'll get to the discussion of some, alternative types of housing that might diversify the housing mix in Fairfield overall. And we might say that certain types of housing are more appropriate in certain areas and less appropriate in others. I think that affordable housing could be located in every neighborhood in Fairfield at different levels of density or intensity or different patterns or forms or types. So geographic indication could guide either density, it could guide design, it could guide the permit process.
Right.
And say, listen, if you're in this area and doing this type of development, that might be a site plan approval, or in some communities, even a staff level approval, in different types of approaches. So really, I think the first question is whether or not we think this is an area worth further investigation. And then I think, Carrie, you had asked a question about arterial and collector roads. It was meant to be an example of the types of criteria that could be used. But again, we might not want to use that phraseology and just, say an arterial or collector road, provided it's in the water or sewer service area, those types of things.
Yeah, okay.
Glenn, a question, maybe Mark can answer a bit, probably Jim or Emmeline. Isn't the update of the POCD sort of focus on that also? Isn't this a necessary part of the POCD where they have descriptions of the neighborhood and future guidelines for the neighborhood?
Well, maybe I'll defer to Jim because I think they're trying to get away from a neighborhood-based POCD plan.
Yeah, I can comment on that. We spoke about this map in the 2016 plan has 11 planning areas, and we're trying to get away from discrete planning areas and be more holistic in how we're viewing things across the entirety of the town, rather than trying to parse out individual areas. So our thought on this map was not that any one of these individual identifiers ranks higher than others, but where you may have intersection of multiple, like a Venn diagram, where you've got multiple intersections, maybe that speaks to an area that might be a higher target area than one that has maybe only one of those characteristics, or in an area of town that's even outside of that. So I think, as part of the POCD, we're looking at more generalized, town-wide planning policies rather than for each individual neighborhood.
And if I could just speak to, I guess I'll turn my video on, sorry. If I could just speak to Carrie's comment, about being a bit mindful about future risk. Sea level rise is a mandated component of the update to the POCD. So we will be talking about that. And internally, Jim and I have had a couple of conversations about areas that we, so the most desirable and the quickest to redevelop has been the beachfront properties, but we are seeing more redevelopment in our riverine areas, which sometimes are a bit scarier in terms of flooding conditions, because you can get these storms overnight where there's no warning and 3 inches dumps without, I think, meteorologists being able to say where that's going to happen. So it could happen, if we get a storm system, we could get an inch of rain while, 3 towns away, they get 5 inches of rain, and we could be that next town over. Mm-hmm. So in riverine areas in particular, it can get really scary. So I think that internally we've had a couple conversations about some of our multifamily as of right zones that are in highly hazardous areas, and maybe needing to look at those in terms of downzoning them for safety purposes, but maybe then reallocating some of that density in some of the more transit oriented neighborhoods that are currently only single family zoned. We don't know how that'll go over, but
no, we know.
It's been an internal conversation that maybe, to offset some of that, we should start looking at that direction.
That's a good point.
I think I'd like to add to what Jim said, because I think Jim's just sparked an idea on my mind, and it may answer some of the questions that Carrie had. For example, right now, I have added these different variables or factors in here, and we've color coded each of them, and you kind of, look at it in terms of a level of specificity. And I think what Jim suggested, or what I took away from Jim's comments, is that we could treat each of these as a separate factor, overlay them on top of each other. And so areas where 3 factors exist would be a more vibrant color or a brighter color than the areas where only 2 or 1 factor exists. So we don't necessarily need to focus in quite so much on the strict boundary of this, but the generalized location. So in other words, taking this map, I think, and treating it as sort of a heat map or an intensity map might help us. And in addition to that, what could also work is the corollary, the opposite of this, which would be factors which might challenge housing density. And these could be areas, again, without water and sewer, in floodplains, in wetlands, and we could have that map. And then between the 2 of them, we're actually kind of telling the story geographically. We think that housing diversity could occur and be appropriate in these areas more than others, but we want to protect these resources as well. What's your thought on that approach?
As long as they're separate maps, because if we get too many more circles and colors on one map, it's going to be totally illegible.
I would agree with you, Carrie. So it seemed to me that the map of areas which are possible housing policy areas could be shades of green and intensity. And actually on this map, these red circles are local, the generalized location of historic centers. They're not actually locations of historic districts, but these would be areas we might want to throttle back in terms of housing. So that should properly be on the other map.
Yeah.
So I think Mark and I can work with MetroCog to kind of advance this to the next stage and come back to you with some guidance on this. Is that okay?
Yeah, as long as you get the riverine stuff from Emmeline, sure.
Yeah, and I think coastal flooding and flood hazard areas, you know, Limois areas, the various factors which might create some challenges for, again, for housing density, et cetera.
Right.
And a question for Mark. The federal funding, I know they don't like to have increased density within the floodplain. Do they consider rivers as part of that prohibition, or is it just hurricane force on?
If it's in the floodplain, it's in the floodplain. It could be off of a river, it could be next to the Long Island Sound. So yeah.
Okay, so our river, Rooster or Mill River, those are also.
Yeah, we have sites that have those impacts.
Okay. Glenn, I've got a little bit of wordsmithing. 1.2 numbers 4 and 5, could they be combined?
I think that might suggest these stay apart. I mean, I think we're going to be adopting a plan. I think once we have a chance to get our concepts together, I would encourage us to go talk to planning and zoning as we did on the 2014 plan to kind of have dialogue and feedback. And I think this concept of a simpler approval permit process is really sort of a distinct thought that they may or may not embrace. So I think leaving it separate allows that conversation to occur specifically, and then we could wordsmith it at the end. So at least for now, Steve, I would suggest we leave those separate.
Okay, I just have one other comment. If you could go back to your map. I like the locational, the neighborhood information that we've been talking about, but you know, technology has changed. And so if we have a site in Greenfield Hill with enough acreage, we could build a nice neighborhood. We could put some housing up there and it could be self-contained with their own detention basins and their own septic. So I don't want that to be prohibited as we go forward.
No,
that wasn't my intent on this map. I think, as I tried to state on the prior page, that you know, affordable housing applications can be filed anywhere, Greenfield Hills or even in the beach area, but they're going to have to grapple with the circumstances and situations at that site as they make their way through the permit process. On the other hand, we might provide regulatory support for, again, the Commerce Drive area and some of the work that's been going on there in the town center, and some other areas of the community in or near or adjacent to or transitions to business sites. And those are areas where we could be a little bit more proactive if we wanted to. But I think the first thing is to perhaps roll out the concept of a locational considerations as part of our work and see what type of feedback we get.
Thank you.
Anything else on part A? That's pages 2 and 3. Otherwise, I'm ready to go to page 4.
Emmeline wanted to say something.
Glenn, I just wanted to kind of tie in there. You keep kind of throwing around a phrase that brings me back to the state's locational guide map. And as you know, if this is going to be incorporated into the POCD, we have to show consistency. So if you use kind of similar metrics to what they use in their locational guide map, that helps us tremendously.
Good point, Emmeline.
Yeah, Glenn, before you hopped on, I'd mentioned to Mark the 1.3 on page 2 is reflect Connecticut's responsible growth principles, which I'm unfamiliar with.
Yeah.
And so at some point, if they could be explained to us, not now, because we've got a lot to cover, but.
It'll just take a second, Steve. So the state of Connecticut, I'm sure you've heard over the last decade or so has been the concept of, or more than that, the concept of smart growth, they've called it. Connecticut adopted their own approach to this. They call it responsible growth. The state has 6 statewide responsible growth principles. They relate to protecting sensitive natural resources, guiding growth to locations with the infrastructure to support it, addressing housing related issues that we're talking about, and others. So I think the issue here in terms of addressing this issue is just overall state plan consistency. I think Emmeline's idea about taking the criteria that they've used and embracing those as part of our locational mapping might help in that regard.
Thank you.
Somehow I've lost my page change feature, so bear with me for a second. There we go. So the next strategy, it's this B approach here, is about encouraging or requiring appropriate design. One of the survey responses, the strong responses, was that people indicated that the design of housing was important to them. This is something that perhaps we could start to consider as part of a regulatory approach or in terms of strategies related to affordable housing. There are ways to do this through a visual preference exercise and creating regulations that actually have images that indicate the type of development that we might encourage. We could actually go as far as creating a pattern book. The state is due to prepare their own pattern book in 2023, or eventually establish a form-based code. And so there are some examples in your booklet. I had an opportunity to work with the town of Simsbury on their regulation. Its regulation was part of the incentive housing zone approach. I'm going to zoom in here a little bit so we can sort of see it a little bit better. And this said, in the incentive housing zone approach, if you were going to do a single family dwelling, these types of forms would be considered appropriate and compatible, and these types of forms would not be. If you were going to do a duplex or a townhouse type dwelling, these building forms would be considered appropriate and these would not. And so there were word text as well on each of these pages that would, in essence, steer people to approaches considered compatible and approaches not. And I think the way this was used in Simsbury for approving a development, which is down the street from me, was to review the architectural design and apply this with the applicant. Never met an applicant who doesn't want an approval until you're able to get specific. And if we wanted to, for certain types of housing, it could be a simple matter that if the house comes in as a house, dwelling building comes in as a permitted use and falls within the operative realm, which is depicted here visually, perhaps that could be a simpler approval process, possibly even staff, depending on the nature of the approach. And if it didn't or fell into one of the other categories, that might be something that would go to the commission. So these are the types of visual guides that we could use. I think one of the comments we had heard early on was we have some crackerjack architects in Fairfield, and we could actually perhaps get some guidance from them. Carrie, as part of our last meeting, had shared some information from the city of Norfolk, Virginia, and they actually have created their own pattern book. And here we have the page which identifies stacked duplexes, and also the page which identifies stacked triplexes. These are building forms or patterns we don't have as much of in Fairfield as Norfolk does, but again, gives you a sense of the visual presentation that is existent in the community or would be considered acceptable. And that could be used to guide design as well. And I think it also addresses some people's concerns overall, that when we use the phraseology of affordable housing, people often think it might be the worst thing they've ever seen, rather than, in these cases, some of the attractive things that they've seen. And then finally, the third approach, which I'm not recommending, it's not a blue line item, it's something to possible consideration for the future. In certain cases, is essentially a form-based code. Canton has a form-based code for certain areas of town. It specifies the design and location and setting of the buildings. And it also has other standards related to materials, et cetera. And if you are able to demonstrate that you comply with these criteria, you get your permit from staff across the county. So that's a much more kind of significant investment of time and money. But I just throw it out on the table as being sort of the considerations. So the blue line items right now is for Fairfield to consider establishing desirable design treatments which will enhance the sense of place in Fairfield, possibly through a visual preference exercise or some other way to identify what we consider to be appropriate and enhance the sense of place. And then following up on that, use that to create a simple Fairfield-specific illustrated regulation. And again, where and how would need to be decided. And then the other issues related to a pattern book or the state prepared pattern book would be a lower priority or something we might look at in the future. Thoughts and reactions on the concept of design and trying to incorporate design into the regulations.
A couple of quick comments, Glenn. One is, I think it's really important, whatever we can do to encourage good design, we should do that. I don't know how it would, if there was a legal challenge, how it would stand, but I really like the idea. And just in reference, Jonathan Rose from Rose Development came up a number of years ago, met with some town folks and showed them some designs of properties he had built out west, and they all loved them. They thought they looked beautiful. And then when he told them that they were 40 to 50 units per acre, they couldn't believe it. You know, design changes people's opinions of the development. But if we were able to enact some good design guidelines, they would not. They could be overridden by 830G, could they not?
They can. I think, again, that we might suggest or enable through a regulation what we consider to be appropriate densities in appropriate areas. But that wouldn't stop anybody, Steve, from anywhere in town coming along with an 830G. That would simply be a different approval process, the state mandated one rather than the locally mandated one. So the approach here might be to treat housing as a way to strengthen our community, its sense of place, promote economic growth, and do all of the other things without having necessarily an 830G fight over it. If we're able to identify what we want to try to accomplish, we could write a regulation to do that.
Thanks.
Yeah, I really would agree that design is very, very important. I don't know that we need a Fairfield specific pattern book. I think we need a kind of New England pattern book, and that pretty much exists. That can be put together and people can choose from that. The easier we can make it for developers to go ahead and build something, it's an incentive for them to build what we want. And the harder we make it, it doesn't stop them there to think twice about it. If we can make things with a lot of things with staff approvals, maybe at a certain, below a certain density, I think it's works really well. And the state is going to be preparing a pattern book, as Glenn noted, and a form-based code, I think, too, or at least that was discussed. So by the time we get through with all of this should be available, at least a lot. And, you know, really people, when they talk about character, they are talking about a kind of New England look. I think there's one street down the beach area where it's got a big A-frame or something, and everybody who goes by that kind of cringes sometimes, I think. But I think it can work and be acceptable. And, you know, and if people like it, it's helps. And we kind of heard some of that discussion in the commission last night. People were talking about, we want to see what it looks like, you know, so all sounds good.
Yeah, I'm in complete agreement with you, Carrie, that I think people want things to look, you know, appropriate to their community. And, you know, if we can do something like that, I think would be a good thing.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm ready to move on now to part C. Is everybody ready?
Yep.
So when the state says the affordable housing plan is the municipality needs to indicate how it's going to increase the number of affordable housing developments in the community. Affordable housing developments is defined in the statutes to include two forms of housing, one of which is called assisted housing. And assisted housing is housing which receives governmental funding or financing in some way, shape, or form. That funding or financing comes with restrictions on tenancy or occupancy. These projects, these developments are generally, let's say 100% of the units would be priced affordably. But again, there would be some level of state or federal investment in these. So typically this would involve developments proposed by the Housing Authority. And so the blue line item here under this in terms of increasing assisted housing is to work with the Housing Authority in support of their efforts to create more assisted housing units. Recognize there's a little history with the project that they worked on recently, which had some drainage and wetland issues, and understand that. Those issues are going to need to be resolved in terms of what is proposed and where it's proposed. But the Housing Authority could help Fairfield accomplish housing objectives, and we could support them in that effort. I think there are four key things as part of work by the Housing Authority. They need to have organizational capacity to do this, and some housing authorities don't. They don't have the staffing they need to undertake development in addition to the management they have. I think Fairfield has a pretty good organizational capacity situation, but they also need land and buildings, they need funding, and they need a zoning tool. So if this is something that we would like to recommend in the plan, we might also recommend that those issues, we try to assist them find land and buildings, including surplus town land or surplus state land or tax sale foreclosure land, et cetera, but try to become partners with them in that effort. The two line items here, which are white, are working with nonprofit developers or for-profit developers. They might work to obtain low-income housing tax credits and then bring get funding from HUD or from the state and come to the town with a particular project related to that. Depending on the nature of the funding, it may actually qualify as an 830G because it is assisted housing, but they might be able to help us meet our objectives. And then 1.4 here at the end is really kind of a question mark, is whether or not we would like to try to create a numerical unit goal for the next 5 years in this area. It can be hard to do that because we don't really know what's going to happen in the permit process, but threw that out on the table for discussion. Thoughts or feedbacks in terms of assisted housing?
Is there any other term to use? I mean, assisted housing, when you say that, I think of,
Yeah.
what do I mean? I mean, assisted housing, they're two different things we're talking about. I mean, which word can be changed here?
Unfortunately, that's the state defined term. So
and what do we call the other things where,
set aside.
Well,
no, I don't mean set asides. I mean the.
Oh, you're talking about actually assisted housing?
No, I think Carrie's talking about assisted living.
Yeah.
Okay, yes, that's what I'm talking about.
That's what I meant.
Yes. Okay. I mean, yeah.
Well, so let's do this. I mean, I think the issue is we can talk about this as government.
We can put subsidized or something, government funded housing.
Government funded. I like subsidized is not a word that people generally are enamored with. So
Okay.
government funded housing, and then in parentheses after that, assisted housing. And I think now people will start to get it.
Yeah.
And we'll refer to the statutory definition.
Right.
So the verbs that I selected for discussion purposes with regard to the Housing Authority was work with.
Yeah.
Now, I think the choice of verbs is always important here. The verbs can be strengthened, the verbs can be tamed. But in terms of trying to help the Housing Authority with their mission, particularly in terms of funding, zoning tools, land and buildings, et cetera, Do those verbs sound right?
Or coordinate with, I don't know if that verb works, but
I would like to acknowledge that we're joined by Carol Martin, who's the director of the Housing Authority, and Carla's here as well from Operation Hope. So.
Yep.
So Carol snuck in at the end. She's not on my screen. So Carol, I know you're out there now. So
she is.
So Glenn, I got a couple of comments. Before I do, though, I do want to make sure that the other members of the committee are in agreement as we move through, or if they have comments or objections, please to state them. I don't want to control the dialogue.
No, I'm in agreement. Yeah. I'm in agreement.
Yeah, good. Thanks, Cindy.
Yeah, as am I.
Yeah, Nancy, great. Just a couple of things. One, I believe the Housing Authority has bonding ability that if they wanted to, they could float some bonds. And I think in this day and age, they'd be a pretty cheap financing source. I'm wondering if we could maybe include something about housing for town employees. If we were going to be working with the Housing Authority, or if the town was to be working with a not-for-profit or for-profit developer, housing for town employees would be a really good idea, I think. And my last comment is, I don't like the numerical goal for this section. I like a numerical goal for everything, but if the Housing Authority can do 70 units, that's great. If they can only do 40, that's great too. But we've got a lot of different pots or parts that could provide some units.
I also use the verb work with nonprofits and work with for-profits developers creating assisted housing units. Is that the right verb?
Consult with, coordinate with, discuss.
I'm okay with work.
I'm just wondering now, actually, as Carrie brought up a good point, is perhaps a better approach your guide? I mean, they're going to, depending on their financing structure and their development projects, et cetera, they're going to compete in the market to acquire a piece of property, going to get funding or low-income housing tax credits, et cetera. The development may be an 830G, depending on the configuration of the units in the development. And so maybe there's really not much of a role here for the town in this scenario, except we're going to receive their application. We're going to try to guide them through the process.
I'm not sure that's entirely accurate. The Affordable Housing Committee has a housing trust fund, could serve as a funding source for developments, both for nonprofits and for-profits to develop housing. So work with sounds fine to me from a staff perspective, but I'll defer to the committee if there's a strong reservation about that terminology.
Yeah, I like work.
Okay.
Anything else on this page in terms of assisted housing?
I always have in mind our discussion with Carla and Carol a few months ago, where the point was made, you do the numbers per development that's right for the community, that's right for that neighborhood, rather the surrounding context, and just that we need to keep that in mind. That's all.
Yeah. The next element here in the state's definition of affordable housing development is the concept of deed restricted housing. So now this is housing which may have a market component to it, but some of the units would be deed restricted. So there's different levels of deed restriction that might be considered. If a development contains at least 30% deed restricted units meeting state guidelines, that would meet the criteria for an affordable housing development, an 830G, and that would be again at the 30% level. You may recall that about 10 years ago, there was a program called the Incentive Housing Overlay Zone Program in Connecticut, and that was predicated on modifying regulations to permit development at minimum densities with 20% affordable units. And of course, the state threshold for when 830G applies is a 10% town-wide threshold. So those are some metrics here in terms of percent of deed restricted units. I think there's a couple of strategies or recommendations here overall. Comprehensively reviewing and revising the zoning regulations to guide development in accordance with overall goals. I think there are situations in the regulations where deed restricted units can be incentivized. We can give a density incentive or a simpler approval process for the provision of affordable units. So it wouldn't necessarily be mandated or required, but if you provide it, you could either get more units or a simpler approval process, or possibly even both, if that was the direction to be recommended. There are certain provisions in the zoning regulations that require provision of deed restricted units. Zoning regulations require a 10% on-site provision if it's 10 or more units, and that's rounded up to the next higher whole number. So at 10 units, it's 1 unit. At 11 units, it's now 2 units of affordable housing. So there's quite a big jump there, and that may actually have some impact on how developments get sized or proposed, et cetera. So something to be aware of here. There were some recommendations in the Commerce Drive, the TOD study in terms of Commerce Drive in the downtown area, possible modifications to height limits and densities, possibly even boundaries, et cetera, and possibly adjusting the affordable housing set aside. So this is an area which could be looked at for refinement as part of this package and other work that the town's doing and the commission is doing. And then as part of that effort, a suggestion for consideration of allowing flexibility in how the deed restricted units are provided. There is such a jump. If I go to an 11 unit project, I have to do 2 affordables, and that means 9 market rate. And when I say that, what it means is if there's a 10% set aside on 11 units, that's 1.1 unit, but the unit number is rounded up, and it's rounded up to 2. So at 9 units, I get 9 market rate, no affordable. At 10 units, I get 9 market rate and 1 affordable. At 11 units, I get 9 market rate. Now I have to provide 2 affordable. And so it's not till you get to 12 units that now it's 10 market rate, 2 affordables. And so that kind of has an impact on the marketplace. So options that could be considered could be for units provided elsewhere, deed restricting an existing unit in Fairfield, paying a fee in lieu of for units not built, or for fractional unit requirements. So the issue is I don't necessarily have that big step at 9, 10, and 11 units. If the requirement is for 1.1 units, I can provide 1 unit on site and pay a fee in lieu of for the 0.1 units. And now that goes into our housing trust fund and is another source of revenue that we can use for other projects. What that fee could or should be is certainly a matter for discussion. So this is a page recommending some ways to think about housing units that are going to be built in the community. And there's 2 major approaches here. I think based on Steve's prior remark, the one at the bottom, 1.3, about a specific numerical goal, perhaps we might want a more generic overall goal. But the strategies, again, are to review and revise the zoning regulations to incorporate some of these provisions, and then perhaps discuss flexibility in how the deed restricted units are provided. Thoughts or feedback?
Yes, I think we're going to need a lot more incentives than that for deed restriction, and we can get to that at some other point, perhaps. I don't know if just a density incentive and a simpler approval process will be enough, particularly for, well, I'm mainly thinking in terms of ADUs at the moment, since that's what's been on my mind. So let me defer that particular discussion to then. I have also never had a problem with fee in lieu of, and now that we have a housing trust fund to receive those types of funds, I think that makes a lot of sense. And there are developments in town now where I think a fee in lieu of might have been more appropriate than what ended up being built or being there at this point in time. And I don't know that we really necessarily want to specify a numerical goal at this point in the process until we get through with this whole document and have had some further look at the whole document. So those would be my thoughts.
Thank you, Carrie.
I do have some comments, Glenn, but I'm hoping some other members might jump in before I do. Okay, I'll jump in then. Deed restricted, I really like deed restricted in perpetuity. Attorneys that I've talked to said that we could even recommend that for 830G developments. You know, the regs say at least 40 years, but that doesn't mean we can't go to 100. As to the 1.2, the flexibility, you know, whatever, first of all, it's got to be up to TP&Z or the town. You know, it's not as of right flexibility. Providing units elsewhere, maybe, but that's a little bit cumbersome. Payment, a fee in lieu for units not built, I don't think that's really worked in other places. I think the money goes into a pot and doesn't get dispersed because it's hard to get the land. You know, it's hard to do development. And so I'm not in favor of fee in lieu for units, maybe fractional, you know, that the way you went through it, Glenn, made it sound like, yeah, we should give them some relief there. So those are my comments.
Do we want to, oh, go ahead, I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry, I agree with Steve about the fee in lieu. I think we kind of tried that in the past and it didn't work with the Southport development and trading off the one unit for a fee in lieu and it just kind of didn't go anywhere. So I don't think there's a structure for that per se. And so, yeah, I'm in agreement with you. I don't think it's really going to work.
Cindy, that Southport development, I think was the reason that didn't go anywhere probably has more to do with the developer than it does with the concept.
I know it was kind of a one-off.
I'm sorry, the fact that it was after the fact.
Yeah, no, I understand all of that, and I know it was kind of like a one-off, but it doesn't seem like going forward it didn't work. I mean, it was as if it was tried and not done. I understand it was a different, you know, scenario, but I agree with Steve. I don't think it's a good situation for the town. There's no land.
I think Steve did touch on one of the major issues with fee in lieu because it goes into a pot and there may not be a project for some time. So, you know, instead of getting the units built more or less right away, it's for some future development. So you don't have the benefit of those units in as timely a fashion as if you required those units to be incorporated into the original development or even built off site. So that's what I think Steve was commenting on.
No, I understand that too, but I would just, you know, it would be good if we could just, you know, maybe do something, you know, more in a quicker fashion. So instead of holding the money, I mean, it seems that trying to get the housing points to get the moratorium or whatever, you know, maybe it could be held for the future. I don't know, but just trying to think of doing something, you know, quicker or whatever.
So how much money are we talking about when we say fee in lieu? Like, how much are we talking about?
I think that's probably, I was going to say the $1 million question, but I shouldn't throw any number out there. I don't think.
But that is the $1 million question.
But I'll throw out a number. It costs $300,000 or so to build a unit. So maybe they give us 300, 275, 250. but they can't give us, you know, the guy from Southport, I think offered like 30,000 or something, some crazy number.
So I think my thought right now is a couple, twofold, threefold perhaps. My first thought is to turn 1.2 from a blue box to a white box, because I think we're not necessarily recommending this in the short term, but what we're suggesting perhaps for discussion to occur on this particular topic. I've heard it said by developers and other municipalities that the 80%, the units at 80% of AMI cover the cost of construction. So that's sort of a neutral. You build the unit, but you're really not making any money on it. The 60% units are very difficult because they cost more to build than you can actually rent it for. So I think the question is, what would that fee be? Would be something that would need some involvement from people who are more familiar with the overall approach. We want funds that we can use for the production of housing. And I don't think we'd want to have a chilling effect on the production of housing overall in Fairfield. So the question is, where is that right number? What might it be? And
it might change project to project, depending on the project.
Mm-hmm.
And also, I think if money is given to the Housing Trust Fund fee of lieu of, and we don't, you know, we can use it to buy land, option land. I mean, everybody keeps saying we have no land. Well, then something we're going to have to do is acquire land by buying it. And it's a lot easier to, if we have some money around, to do that. And then,
set up a
you know,
land
as the owner of the land, we have a lot of clout at that point in deciding who we're going to sell it to and what guidelines they're going to follow. So I really don't have a problem with that.
So how do we want to leave this as blue, turn it to white, or delete it totally? What's the committee's feeling about 1.2?
I say we need to leave it in.
Yeah, I agree.
I don't know if it should be blue or white, but it's got to stay there for discussion purposes.
Yeah, I think it needs to be blue. I think it needs to be blue, and it needs more discussion as we get further into the process.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay, especially for those fractional units.
I'm sorry, what was that?
I said, especially for those fractional units. I think we've got to be able to accommodate that somehow.
There's pretty big stair steps as you go.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
I'm ready to go to page 8 if you are.
Just before you do that, let me, we've got some really smart people on the call with us, you know, Jim and Emmeline, Carla and Carol, and they work in this every day. And so don't be shy about adding comments as we go through, please. Thank you.
The next page, which is page 8, is a similar concept, but rather than constructing new units, this is the possibility of converting existing units to deed restricted. And that can happen a couple of different ways. But because we have funds in the Housing Trust Fund, we could use those funds to acquire an interest in and deed restrict an existing apartment complex for a defined term. We could work with existing property owners to get a deed restriction, almost like a reverse mortgage or a cash payment, or use tax credits or other types of things to get a restricted unit, roughly again at the same price that the unit may be selling within the community. There might be options to extend deed restrictions on existing deed restricted units. And that is something that, again, would require some type of economic payment, either cash or some type of cooperative ownership program, some other type of approach. And then we can also convert units with or for new purchasers. Fairfield has the first-time homebuyer program. We can also maintain, expand the land bank or cooperative purchase program. And this is a situation where the town buys the land and files a deed restriction, but the new homeowner or purchaser purchases the unit and then leases the land from the town. So the total cost of ownership is less because they don't have to finance the land value. That's something that the town would have in perpetuity. So The difference between the strategies we were talking about before in this category is this is, again, converting existing units. It gets a little bit harder because you have to convince property owners why this might make sense, or to build on the programs we already have in terms of purchasing with new owners, et cetera. What are your thoughts about some of the strategies on this page?
Okay. I really like the idea of using existing co-ops and condos where we can. We can buy them, I think, cheaper than it costs to build new, and it disperses them throughout the community.
I would agree with Steve. I guess my question is on 2.4 about the town buying the land. I mean, is that something that the town really wants to be in the position of holding and leasing land? I guess that's more of a question than a statement.
Mark, are you there?
Well, yeah, that's exactly what we're currently doing, and we're considering expanding that as it relates to the Navy Housing or Parkview Commons site. So we currently own the property on which the Greenfield Nordstrom condo development is based. We own it and lease it for $1 a year, and the owners, obviously, they own the improvements thereon. So it is it's a technique that we currently are managing. It's not without some issues along the way, but I don't think there's any perfect solution to this either. So there's issues regardless of what approach you take. But I think this is probably, well, this is the path that we're on with regard to Parkview Commons as well. And we also Greenfield Commons, which Carol now manages for the successor of Mutual Housing, was also, this is structured the same way. So it's the town owns the property and leases it, and the 10-unit senior development structure is situated on that.
Anything else on page 8?
I think these are all good ideas. And it's just as I look at them, what I'm seeing happen, which is a good thing, I think, is that the Affordable Housing Committee is becoming much more proactive or active, and do we have the staff to support it? So that's a concern, but I think these are opportunities that do exist, and we should look at.
This is a great segue into the next page.
Okay.
Before you segue into that, again, let me just make sure the committee members are in agreement. No objections. If they have comments, please.
I'm in agreement, no objections.
Thank you.
Ready to segue, Steve?
Yes, thank you.
So I think the segue part was with regard to managing housing and housing related issues in town. So I think supporting efficient administration is perhaps important for us. I think to continue the use of standard documents, standard affordability plan, compliance reporting, and deed restrictions, I think is an excellent way to manage what could be an increase in the number of deed restricted units in Fairfield. If every project comes in with a separate affordability plan, it's going to be challenging to manage them all if they're all different. On the other hand, if there's a standard affordability plan in terms of the practices and procedures that are going to be followed, that could work out well. I think that there are things that we could consider requiring. One of those is the use of approved third-party administrators. This could be the housing authority. They have the staff and capability to document an eligible household, that they meet the income guidelines, and their income qualifying, that the sale price or rental rate is in accordance with state guidelines. And as a result, they could receive a fee for doing that documentation as part of the transaction. Or in fact, there are third-party administrators around the state that do this. And that could be a requirement rather than having, again, I ran into one situation in a community where the builder's receptionist was the administrator, had no experience, and it really became very challenging. I think the requirement for a standard fair housing marketing plan, there are federal guidelines as to what that needs to be. It doesn't always get followed, but it should be required to be part of the package overall. And then I think another thing to consider is the use of an easement or other instrument to address the possibility of foreclosure of deed restrictions. I think this has not really been an issue historically, but if a deed restricted unit gets foreclosed, my understanding is that the banking laws allow the affordability restrictions to be eliminated as a bank protection measure. And an easement might be a way to address that particular issue or consideration. I think as Steve mentioned earlier, 3.2 here is requiring deed restrictions for a longer period. Could be a standard provision across the board. And other towns in Connecticut are doing this, and other towns in Connecticut are looking at that. I think 3.3 and 3.4 are a little bit more challenging issues. These relate to the concept of windfall. At the end of the deed restriction period, the restriction goes away and the sale price goes from below market to market, and whoever owns the unit at that time captures that windfall. And it's almost like we've entered into a lottery business or operation. And it's possible that there might be a way to capture that windfall at the end of the deed restriction period. That either the town gets the right of first refusal at the then affordable price, and the town captures the windfall at the end, or it be renewed, the deed restrictions be renewed at the end of 40 years, unless the owner at that time or before sale receives a portion of any windfall which occurs upon sale. So these are edgy concepts. But right now, historically, deed restricted units have not been a major part of the overall housing portfolio, or not too many of them expired. But the question is whether or not this is an area for exploration. And the reason they're white is that I wasn't sure that the town would get to these issues in the first 5 years, but maybe this would be something to address later on in this first 5-year period or in subsequent periods. What are your thoughts on page 9?
Mark, weren't you doing something like that on Parkview Commons?
Well, those are deed restricted in perpetuity. That's not to say, again, we've had some issues along the way, not necessarily at Parkview Commons, but elsewhere where we have deed restricted units that, folks are doing something that is in contravention to the deed restriction. So, those are things that have to be monitored and administered. So it is, I agree with, it's an issue that we need to think about. The deed restricted units that we have that we're currently financing through CDBG or other sources, there's typically a repayment option at the end, or an opt-out provision where we recapture monies currently if they're not in compliance. So it's more an issue, I think, as we look at these units that are deed restricted for a period of 40 years. At the end of that period, there's nothing that would bind whoever has title at that time to maintaining those units. So again, to Glenn's point, there's a potential for those folks that happen to be in possession of those units at that time in which they come off deed restriction to reap the benefit of that, to reap a windfall. So I don't think we can go back in time and revisit some of the restrictions that are currently in place, but it's more something prospectively as new units are developed and come online, we have to think about these issues.
And I know in crafting this, I wasn't thinking about any type of recapture provision, but it seems to me that affordable housing is hard to create. It's not inexpensive to create. And for these units to disappear at the end and somebody else gets a windfall, I just felt the public interest might be better served if we were able to cycle that money back in to either retain the units or produce new units rather than seeing it just sort of disappear out the door.
This has been a conversation. I know that the Planning and Zoning Commission chair has shared this concern many times with regard to some of these affordable developments that are restricted for 40 years. At the end, we don't. At the end of the 40-year restriction, we're left with a bunch of market rate units in town. So you're never fully, unless you're working with providers such as the Housing Authority or others that are in that's their mission, you're not restricting these things in perpetuity.
Glenn, how do the other towns address the windfall issue? Do you know?
It's not been an issue which has received a lot of discussion to my knowledge. So communities are starting to wake up to this now. They're paying more attention to the deed restricted aspect and the operation of that. And I think even the issue of a standard affordability plan, many planning and zoning commissioners or communities have not really studied those plans in detail. They're not even aware of what's in them and how they're crafted. And I think, again, this is why this is an area which could be of growing relevance in Fairfield and other communities. The 830D statute actually requires that the state was supposed to have created these documents, and they never did. So there's a checkered past on this.
So Glenn, we have an example, a bad example in New York City. People of a certain age, like my age, saw Michelamas being built back in the 60s and 70s, and turn of the century now, they become market rate and they become luxury condos, and those units are lost forever. And so 40 years goes by pretty quickly, and I'd hate to lose the units we have. Contrary though, if we're doing like townhouses or single family, I know it's really hard. I don't think we can ever do it, but the concept of getting a family in and letting them ride up the equity of the home ownership, which all of us do, which is sort of the American dream. If we could somehow facilitate that, it'd be great, but I just don't know how we do that. So.
I think it's a worthwhile goal, Steve, but the other thing that troubles me in the back of my mind is that because interest rates right now are at historic lows, it's possible the only direction for interest rates to go is up.
Yeah.
And when you capitalize, the way the process works is that we take the percentage of median income, and that's your housing payment. And then we see how much you can afford at prevailing interest rates. So right now, an affordable household can afford more house than they might otherwise. But if they buy the unit, and the state calculation involves an assumption that they have 20% down payment for the unit, but the interest rates go up, they won't be able to sell the unit at what they paid for it. Mm-hmm. And so I think that the issue here would be that perhaps our goal might be not necessarily to create housing for a family for all time and they can get in on all of the equity buildup. There may be situations for that, but also address the housing needs of people who are challenged trying to find housing today for what they need. And that in the future, we would want somebody else to have that housing opportunity as well. So it's a housing for people in all times and all ways. So I realize that's a very challenging philosophical discussion, but I think that something we should perhaps be thinking about for the future.
Can I ask a quick question? I mean, for a market rate development with deed restricted units, all of that, I mean, unless, if it's a property that developer holds long term, this is well beyond the construction loan threshold where they're looking at return of investment. So, that kind of lending and that kind of project structuring in terms of the financing for market rate developers that are doing deed restricted, and we're talking about the standard 10 or 12%, that's well within that 40-year time period. I think what you have to kind of worry about in terms of the windfall is whether or not that developer then sells to another company that then has lending again that has to be, you know, reevaluated against the income return on investment, right? So if they get to say, you know, say they buy it 20 years into the development and there's still another 20 years, they're still looking at those incomes for all of the units in terms of the spread, both the deed restricted and the market rate units. So, you know, you're almost looking at that point at like a third ownership entity, or, you know what I mean? So I don't necessarily buy that there's this huge windfall unless there's transfer of ownership.
I don't think it's so much of a windfall unless you're talking about home ownership units, of which there really aren't any that fall into this category. It's really, and with rental, I think Emmeline's raising a good point, but I think the larger concern, which is what has been articulated by members of the Planning and Zoning Commission and others, is that, and what Steve just spoke to, is that in the 40 years, you know, things come off deed restriction, they're now market rate units, and you lose the benefit of those affordable units. So there needs to be a strategy at some point to preserve those long term.
I guess my follow-up question, Mark, is would they balk if we said for the lifetime of the structure?
I think they would. I think they would. So I think you have to come up with a different approach. It's just a consideration.
But aren't you already doing this in your TOD areas? Doesn't the regulation?
Perpetuity? No, it's not. It says basically for the life of the development, not less than 40 years.
Right.
And that, you know.
I mean,
I think
that's
these are 80% of median, so they're still getting, you know, they're still getting good rents for those particular units. They're not deep affordable. I'm just asking the question because I mean, when I think the financing of it, I think, well, if the building's already been paid for, right? The land's already been paid for. If
well, there's two categories here, Emmeline. So the first category, 3.3, is that, let's say it's a condominium development, the developer sells the condos. That's a situation where somebody 40 years down the road, whoever owns it is going to get the windfall when it resets to market. On the other hand, if it's a rental development, you're absolutely right. It's going to be sold and bought on the basis of its cash flow. And at some point in time, the increase in the rental stream because of the relaxation of the deed restrictions is going to be higher, and that's going to get factored into the value. But that means, again, at some time in the future, we're going to lose those rental units. So I put them in here as white boxes for further discussion. And I think the note that I'm making to myself is to sort of lose the detail here. I think we just need to tee up this issue, if you will, for possible future consideration. And that may come back at some point in time in the future.
Hey, Glenn, have you seen examples where municipalities, as a condition of approval of an 8-30G, are requiring a longer deed restriction period than 40 years?
Well, I think Darien has a regulation that does this, and I think, doesn't your TOD?
Oh, yeah, we do. You're absolutely right in the TOD. What I'm saying as an 8-30G, if somebody comes in with an 8-30G project and the commission approves it, have you seen examples where, as a condition of approval, they've increased that deed restriction period to the life of the structure rather than the 40-year criteria?
I haven't been involved in a lot of 830Gs at that level to be able to give you a good answer, Jim. It's the type of question that on the listserv, we might find some scenarios or something like that for that, but I can't say that I have direct knowledge of that type of scenario. I think it is a topic ripe for discussion, but I don't know if anybody's done it, as you say, as a condition of approval.
And I don't like the concept of for the life of the unit. I'd like to get that deed restriction in perpetuity on the land too. So it's easy to tear down 15-unit structure 40 years from now, or 30 years from now, 20 years from now, and build something. I have a question. I don't want to put anybody on the spot, but we have two developers joining us tonight, Carol and Carla, and was wondering if either one had any comments about 40-year deed restriction versus in perpetuity. It's okay if you don't.
Steve. Thanks for allowing me to speak. And, you know, Carla and I obviously are mission-oriented developers / operators. So we come at this a little bit different. But for the for-profits, I think the town should preserve rights, first right of refusal to obtain or maintain the affordability. I think that would be a huge win for the town, and not giving a for-profit developer after 40 years to flip it to market rate. You know, this is the Gold Coast, whether we like it or not. It's a great real estate investment community, but preserving affordability is huge. So the town out 40 years, I think, should have the first right to say, we want to preserve it and here's what we can do, or you can flip it. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol.
Right. I support what Carol's saying. For us, we have, you know, multiple bottom lines that we're looking at. And so we're looking at maintaining affordability. But for the for-profit developers, I think the town needs to come up with a solution where at the end of a 40-year period or whatever, that there's some kind of kicker that preserves the housing as affordable going forward.
Thank you, Carla.
You know, it's interesting listening to the different perspectives on this, you know, coming from my background as a realtor, not in the nonprofit sector. You know, there's something about this that just really doesn't sit right with me, but I understand the need for wanting to keep these units, you know, affordable. So I'm looking at the word require the deed restrictions to be renewed. And I'm thinking, what if we, you know, rather than require it, what if we gave the owner an incentive to do it? I mean, you know, rather than just say, you have to do this. Otherwise, because what difference does it make if you're basically saying it has to be deed restricted for the life of the property. You're not saying it when the builder or developer is building it, but at the end of the 40 years, basically saying, oh, we're going to continue to do that, and you have no choice. So you might as well say it right from the beginning that it has to be from, you know, the life of the building or the development. So, you know, we thought about offering some kind of incentive to have these developers want to continue to keep them deed restricted.
So my first right of refusal, just to be clear, would be that the for-profit at the end of 40 years could flip it to market rate. So that would be a good thing, obviously, in the town of Fairfield for any for-profit developer. So all I'm suggesting is the town has the opportunity to work something out with the developer or take it on to preserve it as affordable. So I do see the town being in a position of first right of refusal as being an incentive to work with the for-profit developer.
You'd have to pay for it. I mean, somehow. I don't think anyone's suggesting that they just not be compensated in some fashion for that, but there has to be worked out. So I think what Carol's suggesting and others is just giving us the option to have that conversation at that point.
And I think the reason this is a white line here on the table is that I think that it would take time to work this out. As Carol indicates, I think that my concept of how this process might work is that the town gets the right of first refusal at the then affordable price. So the issue is they acquire the unit, so there's no windfall to the then owner. But then if the town decides to, like acquiring the unit, then sell it to somebody, because let's say maybe it needs maintenance, it needs some other stuff, they don't want to get invested in it, but they sell it at then market, they keep the windfall, right? They can sell it out, or the deed restrictions, maybe they don't take the right of first refusal, somebody else makes a windfall. But At this point in time, the way things work, they're left out of the conversation. Other people are making money and the town loses an affordable unit. And I think if we could perhaps manage that better, it might be better overall for the long term. I'm ready to go to the next page.
I was going to say, how about if the town gets a windfall, it goes into the housing trust fund?
That's my thought. Yes.
Yeah.
That's actually what I mean. I mean, I think that we should be able to redeploy that money the way that's most efficient at that time. But if we're these little flowers or plants are sprouting everywhere and people are walking away with windfalls, that doesn't seem quite right. I mean, it's a big windfall, right? I'm on to category E, which is other affordable housing strategies. I think this relates to ways to increase the number of rental assistance units. These units count to the town's 830G calculations, the Affordable Housing Appeals Procedure. And so I think if we can increase the number of rental assistance units in town, our numbers go up. The same thing goes to increasing the number of ownership assistance units, which count to the Affordable Housing Appeals list. I think on rentals, it's really hard to do this. We've got to get more certificates, which are hard to get, or we've got to try to attract certificate holders to town because after a year, they can go to other places. We can't give them money to come to Fairfield, I don't think, because that might violate their income guidelines for them getting a rental certificate. So that's not going to work. So it's hard to say exactly how these would work. The town is working, incentivizing purchasers with CHFA mortgages, with closing cost assistance, down payment assistance, et cetera. So we pretty much have that one figured out. But the rental assistance and stuff is a challenge.
Mark, have we run those numbers recently to look at what, for the income eligible households that are eligible for first-time home buyer? Isn't it a lack of affordable product on the marketplace, even with the subsidies?
Yeah.
We really don't have that much available here in Fairfield, right?
Right.
Okay.
I'm not sure it makes sense for us to incorporate this strategy because we don't have a whole lot of control over it. So it seems like we would best focus our attention elsewhere. But
yep, got it. Thank you. And then down at the bottom of the page is the whole issue of tax incentives. There can be ways to use tax abatements, tax credits, even tax increment financing. But again, these are hard to do. Part of the rationale, go ahead, Mark.
We have done them, and I think that needs to be a tool in our toolkit. So
okay. This graphic is something that I'm still working on, but it's meant to sort of describe for people the basic composition of Fairfield housing stock. Each of this block here, for example, on the page is 10% of the housing stock. So there are 10 boxes in town. And all of these blue boxes represent housing units which sell or rent above the affordability thresholds. And we estimate that's about 90% of the housing units in town. There are a little bit over 10% that actually sell or rent naturally occurring affordable prices. And some of the, about 2.6% of the units actually fall into these colored boxes, which are the state recognized affordable housing. If we could find ways to deed restrict or otherwise incorporate these units as state qualified or state recognized units, we could get to our goal or the state's goal or threshold of 10%. So did anybody find this graphic useful or is it confusing? We should toss it. It's meant to sort of give an overview of the housing stock.
I just think that you need to quantify it a little bit more. Just in terms of what that means, what those prices are, because in terms of quantity of what's available that meets that requirement, yep. I find it hard to believe we even have 10%. I think it's a much lower number. Yep. So in terms of looking at, for example, what would we consider to be naturally occurring affordable housing for households in Fairfield? You know, are we looking at that in terms of, you know, the median income? Are we looking at that in terms of 80% of median income? And then what does that mean in terms of a mortgage and, you know, actual sales price? And I think even having those, you know, because the hope is that it's not just us who are reading this affordable housing plan. So if we include a graphic like this, we need to keep bringing home the message as to what that means, because people who live in these Fairfield neighborhoods, they know what their neighbors' houses are going for and what their own home is valued for. And we need to keep kind of driving home what realistically these numbers mean.
Yep.
You know, and relative, I think, to who that represents in Fairfield in terms of our very service economy oriented commercial corridor, right? That these aren't folks who can afford to live within Fairfield, you know, and, you know, you understand what I mean, Glenn.
I do.
Let me just ask a general question. Does anyone on the committee find this particularly helpful in terms of driving the theme or the message that we're trying to convey here?
Not me. I was totally lost. Yeah.
When I look at it, I say, okay, how can we acquire those naturally occurring houses and turn them over? In other words, buy them, fix them up a bit, and then.
I want to know where they are, but.
Yeah, I
question.
Do, yeah, I do follow what.
Got some, but.
Trulia Rentals, and every time it shows me a rental, I just see what's out there, you know, in Fairfield, and I'm seeing things that I would call naturally affordable. And they also have something that says, okay, you shouldn't buy or rent this unless you know, you shouldn't pay more than this. They're using the 30% figure, you know, make sure you can afford this for rent or housing. So that's pretty interesting to follow. I'll get 1 or 2 of those a week, maybe. It's not a lot, but it's been interesting to see, you know, that there is something that exists. And I think the prices for some have gone up totally outrageous, and they probably have to reduce it if they can't rent it.
The problem is that we don't get any credit for any naturally occurring.
I know we don't.
No, you don't.
And then I want to see this and say, well, how could we get credit? And I guess it's through, you know, doing whatever.
You have to change the state law. So I don't really see that.
I don't think that's.
And I find the whole thing a little confusing, but it's just.
I understand. And it's based on the challenge I had putting it together. It's based on the American Community Survey, which has margins of error around the results. So that's why you can get to some precision. All of the data that was used in the creation of this was in our booklet too, on the, you know, the background information. But again, if it's not helping us tell our message, then I'll move on. Strategy F has to do with both the concept of a moratoria from 830G, which is accumulating the housing unit equivalent points. I think as we looked at this, we think that Fairfield has acquired a significant number of housing unit equivalent points that in the next year or so, other units may be completed. We may be entitled to a moratorium. And I think that we also looked at the number of units in the pipeline. And it was possible that shortly after the expiration of the first moratorium, or even before the expiration of the first, we might be eligible for a second. Little strategies are in here in terms of the concept of a 4-year moratorium, 1 or 2 or possibly more. The concept of becoming exempt from 830G requires that we're going to need to have about 2,200 state recognized affordable units. We have about 556 at present. So the bottom line is we need to have about 1,500 additional units. So the exemption is hard, but the moratorium seems possible. Do we want to include these in our strategy options so that people are aware of what those numbers are? What's your thoughts or feedback?
I think definitely number 1, but number 2, I just don't see how that's feasible. We're not going to do that many units. We're not going to get to 10% affordable.
Yep. Okay. Part of doing this work, I came up with these charts to sort of show activity levels.
Glenn,
yes.
Can I just add that we're getting towards the end, but we're not at the end yet. And I want to try to complete all of this, all of the material. And yep. So we might run a bit long, and we might not be able to do anything else tonight other than to talk about this. But to me, this is really, really critical. and I want to make sure we get through it tonight. Well, thank you.
I'd like to get through tonight, if we can, this booklet, because my next step, I believe, is to try to now assimilate all the work we've done into the first draft of a housing plan. And I think if we can get through this, I'll have enough to get going on that. So let me pick up the pace a little bit. These graphs, I may or may not use them in the final plan, but they showed our progress over time. And the fact that because, again, additional housing units are getting built and the census is resetting every 10 years on the number of units in the calculation, that our affordable housing percentage is probably going to decrease over time unless we're able to step up the pace. There are things that we could recommend with regard to diversifying the overall housing options and choices in Fairfield. There is some regulatory changes that are required as part of the recent Public Act, but we could also look at options to review the zoning regulations, the designed residence district, look at sort of the bulk standards, et cetera. Or this is actually work that we would be recommending to the Planning and Zoning Commission, and sorry, Jim and Emmeline, because that would involve you too. But the other concepts here in 1.2 is this concept of what's called middle housing. Middle housing is a phrase that is used to refer to housing between single family at one end of the spectrum and then larger multifamilies at the other end of the spectrum. And as the diagram shows on page 15, for the different options, these can include things such as 2-family houses or 3-family houses, 4-family, small apartment buildings, street front townhouses, cottage court developments, mixed-use buildings, live-work units, etc. And so while these units may not always be deed restricted, they could address housing needs and circumstances or situations in town. So strategy 1.2 is about considering new regulations to promote more housing options and housing choices. And that could either be just at market rate, but ways to address different housing needs, or there could be an affordability component. The concept for adaptive reuse of existing housing, converting an existing house into a 2-family, a 3-family, or a 4-family, or conversion of a property to a cottage court. And then this other concept of universal design is basically designing housing units, dictating, if you will, that multifamily units would have accessibility features built in terms of door thresholds, the light switch locations, and other things for accessibility. So these recommendations are a little bit outside of the affordable housing area, but they do help address housing needs. Do we want to venture into G or leave it out of our report?
I like it. I have a question. Have you any place in here talked about senior housing or housing for handicap?
We did back in the sort of housing authority in terms of their senior and disabled housing and also their family housing, but not, I think that these housing choices could be ways to address the housing needs, but not specifically as in senior housing. Do you think we should add that in, Steve?
Well, I do think we need to have some section about senior housing and housing for handicap. That segment, the senior segment of our population is growing. I'm right in the middle of it myself. And so we need to have some language about it.
The two types, there's sort of the subsidized and then the market rate. So, but either way, it's more housing options for an aging population. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think you have that in H4, if I recall. It's in white, but it's later on. We didn't get there yet.
Yeah, there's aging in place. Yeah, gotcha.
On page 15, you have the examples. You know, some of them look really good. The missing middle housing concept I like, but I think it's got to be carefully controlled. And I could see where that 4-family on the top right could go in a lot of places, but some of the other designs maybe just wouldn't fit within the neighborhood.
And I think if the commission is interested in pursuing the geography concept, that there are certain areas that we might say, yes, this type of housing or this level of density or this floor area ratio would be okay. That's fine. But then there would be other areas that we would say not as much, or we would have a grid or something that talks about the type of approval process for these. So this wasn't meant to be definitive of what Fairfield would adopt or recommend, but just descriptive that there are a lot of flavors of housing in between single family on one side and large multifamily on the other. And this could be a discussion to be had in Fairfield.
And Glenn, that 1.4, the workforce housing, I live in a neighborhood that was built in the 50s, and there was a lot of naturally occurring, I would consider, workforce housing. And when they come up now, they sell for $350 or $400. They get torn down and rebuilt, and they sell for $800. And whatever we can do to prevent that and to add more workforce housing, I'm in favor of.
Yep.
Steve, what's the name of the street in West Hartford that has all of the duplexes to fourplexes? Could we use that as a visual example, as something that's in Connecticut?
Emmeline, I've thought about West Hartford. Some of the situations that I'm thinking of, and maybe you have some different options, are 3 to 4 stories. And so they just, the size of them and their proximity to the street, right? Because they was like a streetcar suburb, and they were built, and I like them. I think they're attractive, but some people
they're too big in terms of scale, you're thinking.
That's what intimidates people. And they say, oh, it's too close or it's too tall. And the issue is some of these, I've actually, as part of our work in 2014, I got some pictures of some 2 families in Fairfield, and I used them in other communities to say, look, what a cute little 2-family. And why can't we allow that? So I think that we can and should populate this. I mean, Carrie's example from Norfolk, Virginia is really kind of great in terms of what they were able to find in their community.
I just want to say, Glenn, before you move off of this page, that this particular page is important for us in our work with the Planning and Zoning Commission as we forge ahead with our POCD work, and we're trying to leverage this opportunity, as we typically do, to have another public outreach specifically on these topics, to engage, to give the commission some comfort level, or depending on what emerges from public outreach. But this is an important aspect of this planning effort for us. So I would hope the committee shares in that and would keep this as part of our effort to get some public feedback on these particular issues as part of this effort.
My hope, Jim, would be that we would have a draft report to discuss at the beginning of October. And if the committee is comfortable at that point in time, we might be ready to go see the Planning and Zoning Commission to at least explain what we're thinking about end of October, beginning of November, somewhere in there. So I don't know how that's going to work out with your schedule, but that's sort of what I kind of see as next steps.
Can I say something? The picture 4th row down in the middle, cottage court, that one should be called pocket neighborhood, because that's what it is. And the cottage court description, I mean, they're very close and very similar, but pocket neighborhood was brought up by the commission last night in their discussion with staff at TPZ. And, people have heard me talk about that a lot. And there is significant interest, I believe, in it.
Your discussions are bearing fruit. Everyone's talking about it these days.
But yes, so why not?
Can I just say, before you move on, that if you just take a ride down Reef Road and take a left turn on Quincy and a right on Jarvis, and you go through where the Navy housing was, and you take a look at the housing that we built, where on single family lots, we built duplexes that are quite attractive and much nicer than anything else in the neighborhood.
Yep.
And probably similar to what Mark is talking about, if he gets an opportunity to redevelop that neighborhood. It's simple to do. It improved the value and the quality of that neighborhood by us putting those housing there. And that was permanent supportive housing. So some of the people who live in that housing were formerly homeless and had issues. but the housing is still nicer. The neighborhood is still more stable since we moved in there. So you have right in your own backyard, beautiful examples similar to the ones that you're showing.
Thank you, Carla.
And I've also found online examples of duplexes that look totally like single family houses, and I'll send out the link to everybody so you can see that. And the other thing that I don't know if we've mentioned at all, I think we did slightly, but converting some of the big McMansions to 2 and 3 and perhaps 4 family houses where appropriate.
Yep.
And I think that's something that could be easily done. If people really care what they see as they drive through the neighborhood and see what they see from the street from their car. And that's where, you know, it has to look good from.
Would agree. And so that's in here on page 14, here in the middle of the page on the right-hand column, number 4.
Yeah.
Adaptive reuse of existing housing. So that again, I think is something for discussion.
Yeah.
Let me just mention again what the housing that Carla talked about, which I think is really attractive. And I think it's about 10 years old now, something like that.
It's 14 years old.
And I don't believe that there's been any comments, bad comments from the neighborhood, any adverse effect. These were 2 families or two families?
It's 4 2-families on 4 previously single family lots.
Yeah.
So they're 4 duplexes, so 8 units. And the housing is higher quality than the other housing in the neighborhood, more attractive than anything else in the neighborhood, and kind of anchors that neighborhood.
Yeah.
So, and it's deeply affordable, permanent supportive housing for people who have significant barriers to success in housing, and they have been successful there.
Yeah, it's great. It's
attractive.
Example in our own backyard.
High quality. It sustained itself through Storm Sandy, and because it was built to all expectations and qualifications, and but that's just one example of housing. But if you're going to look at these smaller affordable housing developments, you have a beautiful example that you should be proud of right on Jarvis Court, and you should look at that. And I just want to say that, you know, don't vilify the larger projects, because some of them, like the project on Pine Tree, is beautiful. Yeah.
Pine Tree is
appropriate and created a lot of affordable housing in a very high quality neighborhood appropriate way. So not all large construction is negative for the community either.
Thanks again. Maybe back in touch with you and Mark and Carol and others to get pictures.
We have pictures.
Yep.
Yeah, might be a good example of your cottage court type development.
Cottage court, I love that.
I'm up to page 16 at this point in time. I think there's perhaps a couple of issues here. I think it's important for a town to have organizational capacity to deal with issues. So I think the Affordable Housing Committee is really the entity moving forward to address the issues related to housing. So I think we're in good situation there. I think maintaining a designated staff person is also important. Mark's position with everything that he does is full-time, but Mark's disappeared. He's hiding under his desk, I think, at the moment.
Yeah.
But oh, there he is. But I think it's important for us in Fairfield to think about a succession plan. I've had occasion to work in a lot of communities in Connecticut. Mark has a very particular skill set, and there aren't a lot of people like Mark. And so having capacity for the future for this issue, as we continue to look at ways to increase affordable housing, is going to be sort of an important consideration for us. So for somebody to walk in, to take over Mark's position with all the detailed knowledge of the different programs and the financing and deed restrictions and provisions isn't a simple task. So I think it's important for us longer term to think about the organizational structures that we're going to have in place and how to make those work effectively in the future. I also have recommended for possible long-term, based on some information that Carrie has shared at the last meeting, this concept of a community land trust. And this isn't to compete with any of the entities already in town, but to provide a way to complement efforts to help accomplish affordable housing initiatives. And that's something I put in with the verb possibly for investigate. Again, we're fortunate to have the Housing Trust Fund to maintain it, maintain the zoning permit fee, which has provided the funding now available to accomplish some of our objectives. But highlighted here in red is somehow for the committee to start to develop a decision framework to how funds are going to be dispersed. If we have a approach which perhaps doesn't have criteria or considerations, I don't want to say the money's going to disappear. There's quite a bit of money there, but I think how can we use that most effectively to leverage the types of results that we want? What are those decision trees? And I think that's a conversation which probably needs to be had sooner rather than later. And by sooner, I mean sometime in the next year or two, as to what might be our framework. And it's always subject to refinement over time as circumstances and situations come up, but at least establishes, again, a framework for these types of decisions moving forward. I think as part of, CDBG funding, there can be action plans and the program objectives. And that might be something which might provide a model for us to start with, or maybe there's something that we should craft unique to Fairfield. But again, we have significant funds available to do stuff. How can we leverage that the most and the best? At this point in time, number 4 is, I'm not sure that we need other revenue sources for the Housing Trust Fund, but again, something for us perhaps to think about for the future. Down at the bottom of the page is just an encouragement for updating the plan of conservation and development, elevating housing and housing options to a major focus of the POCD. It seems to be consuming more attention in Fairfield and around the state, and addressing those sorts of issues. Thoughts, comments, feedback on this page?
Well, first of all, we all know that Mark is irreplaceable. So there's nothing we can do about that. Mark, you can't retire and you've got to live forever. The Housing Trust Fund, I feel like it should have been done last year. We really got to get going on this. And Mark has a project he's working on. We know the projects take a long time, but there must be some projects that have a shorter time frame. And I know that Mark has talked to a guy or two who talked about 2-family or 4-family housing, but we really need to market. We've got to let people know that the funds are available, and if they've got some projects, they should come talk to us. And we did talk about application guidelines last year, and so we've got some stuff in the file, but we really do need to get moving on that.
Is there a need to include strategies such as update the plan of conservation and development when it's not really the responsibility of the Affordable Housing Committee to do that? Obviously, there's a housing component in it. What we're doing will inform the POCD, and we're working closely with planning and zoning, but we spent a lot of time wordsmithing as to how we were working with nonprofit and for-profit developers, and here it sounds as if we're having a strategy or recommendation in our plan that really is not in our wheelhouse. So that was my only thought here. And, we have Jim and Emmeline here. I don't know if they have any thoughts. I mean, I know this will help their work and the work of the commission, but I'm just curious as to whether or not we need to actually have something spelled out like this in the plan, or at least acknowledge that it's not really, we're playing a supporting role.
Yeah, I don't think we really need it. They know what they're doing and what they have to do, so.
Got it. Anything else on page 16? Page 17 really sort of has a couple of things in it, one of which is the importance of supporting people's ability to age in place. These are people who actually live in Fairfield today. And they may be facing lifestyle issues, social isolation in the age of COVID for seniors and other people, single person households. And so there's a bunch of programs that the municipality offers that help support these people. And without these programs, they might end up or need an alternative housing solution. So continuing these programs can be important from a housing perspective as well. In addition to that, I think continuing the role of the Affordable Housing Committee in terms of education and collaboration with all of the related groups in terms of maintaining information, et cetera. So these are recommendations which aren't really housing generation or housing creation specific, but I think they're things which are related to housing and housing needs in the community. How do we feel about these two?
Yeah, it's important, and I think we need to say it and just put these things out there again, because I just always wonder how many people really know about them.
I would agree with Carrie. Plus, I think the more you show people this, the better. I mean, just to have them think about it.
And Glenn, promote education was, I think, goal number 11 from the last affordable housing plan.
Thank you, Steve. So I feel I've received enough feedback from the committee at this point based on our discussion of the survey results, the information that's from the American Community Survey, from our discussions and meetings, that actually start putting together a draft document to present these strategies in a way that will inform and engage the community in our work and some of our strategies for the future. I don't envision a lengthy document. I think the 2014 plan really at that time was informing the community about this issue, reintroducing the concepts from the 1988 plan. I think that this plan, based on the state guidance, is a little bit more specific in terms of the increasing the number of affordable housing developments. So I think it's going to get more targeted. So I think the report, in terms of length, I think it could be in the 20 to maybe 30 page realm, something like that. And the effort, I think, on my part is to try to make it clear, concise, and well presented in terms of the information and recommendations. And how does that sound?
And with a lot of visual examples.
Yeah, Glenn, I think it's critical that we get the public input. Yep. I'm not sure exactly how, but we got to do it soon. And so if we're going to have a 20 or 30 page document, we might need a slide deck or some PowerPoint, something yep. to make it easier to absorb.
So let's talk about next steps. So my thought was, in my mind, is that we would, as a committee, come to a consensus that we had a document we were comfortable sharing with the community as a whole. And so I thought something that kind of brought all of the booklets and things that we have done to date into one document, as concise as we can. But I think, as Carrie said, I'm a big fan of well-illustrated visual examples as well, would be important, would be the first, or not the first step, the next step. I think, as I had indicated earlier in my remarks to Jim, that planning and zoning is going to be a key player in here. And for us to go to public meeting without running something by them might not be the best approach. So we might have a working session with them to kind of talk about ideas. And then subsequent to that, we could then go and have a meeting in the community. So it's possible. Our next meeting is the beginning of October. I feel I need the time between now and then to, or not beginning, probably early October. I think I need the time between now and then to get the draft report together. We could go to see planning and zoning within a week or two after that meeting. And we could then have a public informational meeting in the beginning of November. And then I think at that point in time, we take stock of where we're at and what we think our next steps should be. I think the public meeting would involve a slide deck and exercises, et cetera. And I think given the COVID status at that time, we'll see if it's going to be an in-person or if it's going to be a Zoom meeting or however we're going to approach that.
So Glenn, I don't think we can make a decision tonight about the calendar, and it's really critical that we meet with Jim and Emmeline for sure. We need that working session, and so maybe you and I and Mark should talk next week about refining the calendar. It'd be really great if we could get something out to the public in October. If it's got to be November, all right, but we've got to check the holiday schedules and.
So that, I think, Steve, you're right. I mean, I think the Thanksgiving to New Year's window is a challenging time to have a public meeting and expect to get meaningful feedback. So I think and we're not in a huge rush here. I mean, the statutory deadline for adoption is June 1 of next year. So we can work and refine our plan and begin the public engagement process after the first of the year, if that's the way the schedule worked out best. But I think moving forward in the way that works best in Fairfield it should be our goal. So I think, why don't you and Mark and I talk? In the meantime, I'll start crafting a document, and then we'll figure out a schedule that works based on what we come up with.
Mark, how does that sound to you?
That sounds fine.
Yeah. And the rest of the committee, that seem okay to you guys?
Seems okay. Yeah, if you need help with social media or a website, I may be able to help with that.
Thank you, Carrie.
Yeah, that would be great.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I apologize. This is Heather. I have to go. It is the witching hour in my house.
Thank you, Heather.
Thank you.
Been very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.
So it's 9:04. We could go a tad longer if there were some important issues, Mark, that you wanted to cover. You know, Carla and Carol had some ideas about the American Rescue Plan money. I don't think we've really got an ADU update.
I can do a brief ADU update, but it's very brief if you want to hear it. So,
what Mark is, what's important on the schedule to you?
I think to hear from Carrie with an ADU update is fine. Carrie and I both sat through, as did Jim and Emmeline, a planning meeting with the Planning and Zoning Commission last night, where the subject came up as it relates to the recent legislative session. So, Carrie, I know you're working on a pamphlet and a workshop. Yeah. You want to go into that?
With the Fairfield Senior Advocates has been preparing some material to use when we do have a meeting for the public about ADUs, because we do have to publicize that a lot. But last night, the commission was discussing the legislative status, and I didn't take notes, so Jim and Emmeline just chime in if I miss anything. They were very receptive. Jim was pointing out that basically our current ADU regulations are pretty much in compliance with what the state is going to require, and that there were some minor revisions that perhaps we would make, and the commission seemed, you know, they were fairly liberal about it, I would say. I mean, there wasn't any problem in terms of what I was hearing. They wanted to look at some things, possibly changing some setback rules and some other things, but it was all fairly minor, that pretty much we are in compliance with what the state was proposing. There may be some changes, but it seemed okay to me. What did you two think, Jim and Emily?
That said, you still have a limited, you either comply fully or you can opt out.
Yeah, or you can
there was that conversation.
Opt out and then re-adopt something.
Yeah, if I may, there's really two main areas where our current regulation disagrees with the regulation put forth by the state. Firstly, our current ADU regulation only permits detached accessory apartments in the 2-acre zone, whereas the statute now says they could, anywhere that you permit an ADU, they could be either attached or detached. And secondly, the statute requires that any property that has a single family dwelling is eligible for an ADU, where our regulations presently restrict them to single family zones. We have many examples of multifamily zones that only have a single family house that wouldn't be eligible under our current reg, what would be under the state. And also our current regulation prohibits ADUs in the beach district. So we think, and I think the commission agrees, and I think they're trending towards opting out, but opting out with a greater, with an expansion of opportunity. I think opting out mainly because I think we want to preserve the prohibition of ADUs in our beach district, which is a fairly unique, environmentally sensitive geography. But at the same time, they seemed open to the idea to expanding the opportunity for detached ADUs in other zones outside of the 2-acre zone, and also considering allowing properties that currently have a single-family house in a multifamily district to be eligible. So I think it's going to be a mix of opting out, so we're not required to have them in the beach district, but also expanding opportunities for detached ADUs in having ADUs in the multifamily zone. So it's I agree. I was very encouraged by the discussion last night that there seemed to be very open to the idea of the expanded opportunities. So I think although the headline will probably be opt out, but it's going to be opt out with more opportunity.
That's a good slogan.
Thanks, Jim. Okay, so if we could, Carla, Carol, do you want to give us your thoughts about how we might use the $25 million that the town of Fairfield is going to be getting from the Fiscal Recovery Act funds?
Thanks, Steve. And thanks to everybody for very brief. I know you guys have worked so hard on this plan, so it's a great start, and very much appreciate everyone's efforts. So you folks know we have both state tranches of the coronavirus relief fund coming to the state, and they have discretionary powers to allocate them, as well as the town of Fairfield. And both Carla and I had reviewed, at least initially, what was published on a first pass for the allocation of the $24 million. It comes in to the town of Fairfield in 2 tranches, $12 million apiece roughly, and looked at the allocation, and to my certainly disappointment, there's a whole bunch of folks in Fairfield that we consider the most vulnerable residents in town that there is limited funding for. There is some service funding for, which we completely support, both the Housing Authority and Operation Hope, going for, temporary and emergency types of services. But these funds also have to be sustainable. They have a life period, they have an end date. And although we need to provide a temporary and emergency services over the next 3 to 4 years, the issue of not having enough units of affordable housing targeted to our most vulnerable residents right here in Fairfield is deeply disappointing. It is an eligible use, as the Department of Treasury has provided guidance. And I would really love, actually, the support of this, very important committee to acknowledge the crisis and to demand that there's an allocation for creating new affordable units for our most vulnerable. Carla and I are living day to day in this crisis, and the advocacy needs to be done now. And so I would just urge everyone here, no need to make any decisions tonight, but to really consider deep down how we can help our neighbors. And Carla, hopefully you have something else to add?
Yeah. What are the stipulations to the money? Are there stipulations to the money? 24 million?
Yes, the Department of Treasury.
There's always stipulations.
Yeah, I know. I just don't know what they are.
The Department of Treasury has provided guidance, and there's been clarity on the obligation of funds and the expended deadlines, and the town will be audited. And I'm deeply concerned that one of the eligible uses is for affordable housing, and that as of now is not on the table, not $1 of the 24 million. It's deeply troubling to, frankly, the Housing Authority, our mission, and more importantly, the Housing Authority, our neighbors in town.
Right.
So Carol, is there a list where the town currently is proposed to allocate the dollars? Is there something that we could look at?
On the town's
Yes.
website. Yes, and I'll make sure the committee has a link to it.
So,
Okay.
you know, I don't want to keep everyone late, but I just want to say that it's in some ways kind of a glaring omission. And I think that your committee should be concerned, as you are the Affordable Housing Committee, that this important way of serving people who are affected by the effects of the coronavirus pandemic is not even being considered. And, you know, I am fortunate to be considered in that funding for providing some services, but this isn't a unique windfall that could be addressing a major problem and help fill a gap of affordability here. And there hasn't been a champion for this. And it's not that there aren't other interesting projects being considered, but they don't necessarily address the spirit of the Recovery Act, which is to help vulnerable people who have been affected by the virus. So I support what Carol has just said, and I hope that you will consider taking a look at the list of potential funding opportunities and question why there's no affordable housing on there. If you are following anything regarding the eviction moratorium being lifted, and you understand how many people are going to be in need of housing, in addition to all the people who haven't been working during this crisis, and all the people who have been affected by closures of companies, downsizing of organizations that have been hiring them, you know there's a tremendous need for affordable housing here, right in town, with neighbors that you can look to the left and right for where you live and where you work, who are struggling. So it's a really critically important and use for funds, and it's been overlooked in Fairfield.
Thank you, Carla. Is there also a list of proposed uses that you or Carol could give us? Because if we were to support affordable housing, that's a very broad topic that needs to be more defined.
Stephen, the answer is yes. Carla and I have been speaking. Obviously, these funds have to be obligated within a certain time period and have to be expended in a certain time period. I have the opportunity to work with a faith-based organization who actually is willing to provide land to the Housing Authority and our nonprofit for the development of affordable housing for our most vulnerable. And so the answer is yes, I can provide a budget, if you will, of what we would need to effectuate that transaction and actually construct units. And I'm happy to provide that to the committee. I have a meeting set up early next week with the first select woman, who has been a huge supporter, obviously, of the project that I built in Pine Tree. We hope, you know, our idea will be well received. But most importantly, these opportunities, as everyone knows in real estate, are uniquely a matter of timing and the ability of a willing seller and the ability to pay from an existing or potential buyer. And so, you know, this is, you know, for lack of a better word, a great, you know, and perfect time, but it does need advocacy. And it would be truly a success story for the town, the Affordable Housing Committee, town leadership, et cetera. So Steve, to answer your question, we are willing to put pen to paper and provide you with some details. As you know, location. But we do believe this actually could be and should be very well received, and it is an adaptive reuse. So I want to be clear, we are not taking virgin land and redeveloping it. We are repositioning an asset that a faith-based organization owns, and we will be using an adaptive reuse method. So hopefully that will be well received by our political and elected officials.
So this is an actual proposed development, which is great, rather than just an amorphous kind of program. And Carla, would you be working with the Housing Authority providing services?
Absolutely. We have an agreement with each other. Anytime that we can work together and where I can provide services for any of the Housing Authority's projects, we are in and we're partners. And that would be no exception to this one.
So please send us some information. Thank you.
We will.
Okay.
Thank you for letting us speak.
Yeah.
Thanks, Steve, and the committee and staff. Great to see Mark, Emmeline, and Jim. Keep up the good work, guys. You're incredible.
Mark, anything else?
Nothing that requires any action tonight.
Fine. Okay. Well, let me say thank you to everybody, and especially to Carla, Carol, Jim, Emmeline, and Herb, if he's still on, and of course, Glenn. And we will, we might communicate before the next meeting, depending on what Glenn and Mark and I talk about. But otherwise, see you in October.
Steve, should we say go Longhorns for Jim Went?
No, I just happen to be in Austin over the summer and in the store. I'm not. I don't profess to be I bleed Husky blue, but I'm not real Husky blue right now.
You all tell them.
Okay. Bye, everyone.
All right.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.